I'm delighted to be here, and the fact that it's Friday and there are so many of you here, life doesn't get any better than this. This is just absolutely grand. My mission today actually is to bring you more deeply into the fold of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, not just because it's something I think it's great, but because it is for me the heart of the teaching learning process. What we are now learning through discovery of students' learning processes and meaning-making processes is really changing the way we teach, the way we position students to learn, the way we can look at how students develop what I call enduring learning. And that's probably going to be the heaviest theme that I'm going to discuss today, is that this scholarship is really focused on the ability of students to use, apply, synthesize in contexts other than the ones they learned, what you have taught them. So let me begin with an example, because examples help us. Two students I interviewed had just completed taking a general education history course. And I asked them, what did you learn? What did you take from the course? And the first student said to me, history is just dates, names, places, wars. That's a lot. He said, they have absolutely no significance to me, and I'm just glad that course is over. I'm done with it. Second student says, because they were together during the interview, gee, I'm surprised that you say that, because one of the things that I can say I honestly learned from my course is to question who wrote the text. And I thought, that's beautiful. There's a piece of enduring learning that there is, and it, I'm sure, had everything to do with the dominant pedagogy and the pedagogical differences between those two particular courses. What I think we are most interested in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is not just improving what happens in a course, but how we are systemically thinking about revising, reinventing, innovating curricular, co-curricular design to develop enduring learning, learning that's here and here, learning that lasts so that when students graduate from our institutions, they have developed this repertoire of knowledge, abilities, habits of mind, ways of thinking, knowing, raising questions, taking perspectives on issues that's their own, and that they can draw forward in contexts other than the ones that we have provided for them. And that's really hard work. But the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning provides us unique opportunities to explore how students can make that enduring learning, or if they are really in what I call passing through events. What psychologists call what happens to us when we think about something in one room and we walk into another and we can't remember it anymore, event boundaries. So the students say, well, this is good enough to pass the course, but I lose it. Or as we just heard, they flush it as part of that. So what I'd like to do in the amount of time we have together is to sort of congratulate you on this context that I am operating out of. This is a well-written context for the work of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And when you see that the ultimate aim of this is to move towards developing novel teaching methods and practices that can lead to the measurable enhancement of student learning. And what I'm going to say, just as a preliminary to my first point, is that we are really nationally focused on all of our students now. Not just the ones who are going to get it, but the ones who are struggling to get it and trying to figure out why is that so difficult for you to be able to do, so that increasingly more students can advance or improve their learning. And that what we learn from the projects that we engage in should be shared widely, not just in this institution, because it advances practices here, but for the rest of the world to be able to say, gee, maybe I could try that, maybe I could build on what I've learned from this particular institution. Because for all of us, the concern is that we can graduate more students at higher levels of ability than ever before. So this is a grand, and I must say, a unique experience for me. Most institutions will talk about this, but have not gone so far as to say, this is what we mean by it, this is the philosophical context, this is the working context that we are building ourselves out of. So I really want to talk first about why make this commitment to the scholarship of teaching and learning. I mean, I meet many faculty, and I'm going to use myself as the living example here, who will say, well, what's to worry about? I think I teach pretty well. My student evaluations are strong. Students say they've learned a lot. I'm not going to worry about this. I have nothing to worry about. My evals go up through promotion and tenure. So let me address that. The concern is how long they retain that learning, right? Research will show that students forget 30% of what they have learned in your experience or your course the moment they log off, the moment they walk out of your classroom and go on to other things. And you can imagine the rate of decline thereafter. So are we teaching just for that time in that experience, or are we really standing back and saying, these are the outcomes that I want all of my students to be able to own, apply, reapply, use, think about, beyond the course that they have had with me. And for many of you in disciplines, professions, it's absolutely essential that things that you teach do remain with students because others are building on what you believe you have taught. But the retention issue is not as strong as we'd like to think. So my entry into this world comes because my hubris was seriously bruised. I decided as a junior faculty member many years ago, and I am graying, I need to say that, to interview my students 2 years after I had taught them to find out how much they remembered. It's not much. They could remember that I dressed up as the wife of Bath, because in the course I assumed her role to speak in Middle English. That was the purpose of it, but they couldn't remember why. Right? So as happy as I thought they were, and they clapped, and I thought, oh, this is a wonderful moment, I didn't achieve what I thought I had achieved for the long haul. That moment was so serious for me that I walked around with my head down saying, I'm a junior faculty member, and I can't even assert that what I've taught students is still with them. What's wrong with this? Turns out, at the same time as I'm feeling pretty down about this, I became the chair of our English Theater Arts and Communications, but I was always associated with the teaching of literature and writing. And my door had a very large opening so people could slip things under it anonymously. And what would happen is my colleagues from other disciplines would periodically slip through student papers and say, so is this what you call good writing? And these would be coming through quite frequently. And I was looking at them, and they were right. These were upper-level writing samples, didn't look very good not only from the grammar conventions of the language, but also from their ability to develop a well-focused thesis, hypothesis, support claims, all of those things that a lot of us see in student work. When I presented this to my colleagues, they were sort of shocked, saying, but wait a minute, we taught them how to write in their freshman year. But the question was, who else was building on that writing from the first year? And it turns out not very many people were. Yet we expected at the point of graduation that we would have these highly refined, well-developed samples of student writing, and we just didn't see them. But that evidence brought us to our knees to say, we've got to understand what it takes to develop good writing in students. And a couple of the case studies I will share with you today have said the same thing, but how do we get our arms around that? So what we recognized is, though we may have thought we did a great job teaching those writing courses, where did students travel with that learning? Who else was asking them to write? Who else was building on that? That was an absolute mystery, and apparently not much was going on. So these kinds of experiences, direct experiences of what we're seeing in student work, is really what brought certainly me and certainly my colleagues to say we really need to think more carefully about how students actually do learn how to write. What will it take for this to happen? So I want to talk about that and this issue of how well learning travels with students. So what you have taught them, how well does that go with them, and under what pedagogies might it go even better? And then finally a little bit on how research is showing us how difficult the teaching learning process is. It's just not that easy to say in a linear way, this is what you should know. And it's what's going on here that I think is probably the most promising area of scholarship that we can engage in now. I mean, of course I'm interested in the products they teach, but that they reveal to us. But I'm really more fascinated right now about the meaning-making processes that students are engaged in that account for those particular products. And that's a fine, I think, area for scholarship. I want to share with you 3 case studies of people, and you're going to hear live ones today in the faculty panel, which is extraordinary, and then how you can begin to think about making this commitment yourself. Not that it'll be full-fledged today, but maybe some of what we talk about will enable you to think about some things. Well, for me, the commitment now, and I would say nationally, the commitment to this is such that we are really concerned with all of our students. And I don't think there's ever been a period in higher education where we have seen such an incredible demographic spread across our institutions. First generation international students, students coming back after many years away, extremely large range of learning styles, sets of experiences, sets of understanding that people bring with them that actually can work against what we may be trying to do, as I'll share with you. And what we're really shooting for, in terms of our longer-term outcomes for our students, is the integration of their cognitive abilities, what they know, understand, and you know this through Bloom's taxonomy, reaching all the way up through their ability to create, imagine, perhaps their psychomotor abilities, such as hand-eye coordination, or the well-timed movements of a dancer, and not to mention the dancer with a partner. How does that work? And then their affective domain, their values, attitudes, and what I like to refer to as their readiness to respond to a particular situation in an appropriate way. And for many of you, that's particularly in the health professions, people have to respond to situations in a certain way immediately. And what we're looking at then in the scholarship of teaching and learning is the degree to which students over time integrate the knowledge, psychomotor, if that's part of your program study, and the affective domain. And we're looking at that in terms of the forms of representation that we ask students to represent this to us in. So it may be different in one discipline than it is in another. But what we're trying to see is how well do students integrate these into the research they engage in, the proposals they write, the projects that they undertake. And these may be broken down chronologically, but in the end, we're looking at how well all this comes together for people. So when they are faced with a problem that we've not given them, they can pull from the experiences and the learning they've had to be able to solve a particular issue. And at any point, I'll talk about some of the blocks and the barriers that we have to try to work through to enable this learning of just the cognitive level initially. So, related to this then is, and I'm going to ask this of you, is how well would you say students travel with what you've taught them? Or do you know? Might even be something beyond that. How well do they integrate in your course, but even beyond that? Transfer, analyze, apply or reapply in a later course, for example, in a later module. Reuse what you've taught them. And what I like about the student who came from the course who says, I begin to think about who wrote that text, is she's taken that with her as she goes into other contexts. I'm thinking about who wrote that. What's the context for that? How well do students synthesize, restructure previous incorrect learning? And I'll go through a wonderful case study on that. Because students come to us with preconceptions, hard ones, beliefs that are just so solid that it doesn't matter how wonderful a teacher you think you are, they're not moving. They can fake you out, they can figure out what you want as the answer, but they'll spring right back to where they were before. So think about this in terms of these capabilities, in terms of within your course, or within a module, along the chronology of their learning. If they learned it in X, can they next semester apply that? So the best example I can give to this to you is, have you ever said to your students, you should know this by now? And they say, oh no, we never learned it. And you know they were supposed to have learned that before. But then the question really becomes about, did they really learn it the first time? I'll talk a little bit about that in some really interesting research. And can they transfer from one subject or topic? Many of you are talking about these wonderful experiential opportunities you have. Do they transfer the learning that they have supposedly developed from that point on into that situation? Did they transfer those sensibilities to a particular issue, those perspectives into that, from an exercise to a case study? It's always amazing for me to see that students can do repetitive work, such as drills, pretty well. As soon as you move into a case study, writing, fall apart. So why is that? That's a big problem, right? People in science will talk about this before. They know that they can define the term, but they can't use it, right? They can't, in the analysis of the problem, show how to bring that into the analysis, because they're still at the stage of definitions. I can define it, but I really don't understand how it actually works. One of the keys seems to be is the degree of engagement. And the other new piece that I think is really important is the amount of sustained commitment to doing that or learning that. So in other words, if I did this, would just say, well, here's the definition of this, make sure you know this next time, I'm just encouraging surface learning, which means they would memorize it, but then dump it or flush it, as Rand was saying, and then it's gone. But if I had engaged them in thinking about and applying that and using it in a relevant situation, the likelihood of my having at least anchored a possibility of sustained would have increased substantially. But are there instances in which you would say, no, students don't transfer very well or synthesize? Or is everybody doing what you want? What would they have difficulty with? Yeah.
I think I mentioned it to you before with experiential learning. We require students to have experiences outside of the university, internships, study abroad, service learning, and yet when they graduate and go on job interviews, they don't do a good job of articulating how important those skills would be to them.
Yeah, or what specifically did I learn or rethink?
Or other than just going somewhere.
So I don't know if you could all hear her, but she's talking about people engaged in the range of experiential learning exercises such as internships, community-based experience, study abroad. You might say I enjoyed the experience, I liked it, but I can't really tell you what I gained from it, what I'm rethinking as a result of it. That's a powerful moment when, as the first example I'll show you, when you actually restructure your learning. That you're not thinking the way you did before because something has triggered a restructuring of what's going on. So actually, in one sense, my experience interviewing my students did that for me. At least it opened me to say, you're not as good as you think you are, Peggy. And because I was seeing the world from how I understood, and if I only repeated it, and I did it in this way and that way, they would get it. I was not focused on the engagement and the sustained commitment to learning X that I needed to do. All right, so let me just share with you some of this really interesting research on learning, which shows a lot of what we have to think about and is sort of the basis of some of the problems you may wish to explore in the teaching learning process, is that learning is really a meaning-making process. And you can have students in your class who aren't making the meaning. They're there. And what they're doing is they're writing down everything you say, in some cases, but they're not even making meaning while they're doing it. So sometimes they'll stop you and they say, what was that word you just said? So I can write it down. So they may be there, but they're not making the meaning that we're finding in the work of students who are successful. They are actually restating things in their own words as they're listening, as they're seeing, as they are experiencing things. But here are the issues that are sort of fascinating for us to deal with is what we are working against in the teaching learning process are often these aspects. Egocentricity. I've always believed this. I grew up in a family believing this, and this is the way it is. So I can dress up like the wife of Bath and do all sorts of things, but that may not be restructuring, changing what's going on here. But students usually know how to fake us out to say, well, what the answer is X, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the learning has occurred at all. The other is sociocentricity, so that I come from a group that believes this. This is the behavior we've all engaged in. This is the way you do things. So a good example of this would be, a faculty member just shared this with me last week, is that she was looking at student writing in her first writing course, and she noticed that there were a pocket of students who would use commas after almost every 3 words. So she said, I'm curious, what's your reasoning behind doing that? And they said, well, we learned that you use commas when you take a breath. And so she turned to them and said, do you all have asthma? But that's the thinking that's incurred, but she wouldn't have known it if she hadn't asked, right? If you hadn't found this out. Narrow-mindedness, routinized habits, this is how you write a 500-word paper, period. This is how we go about it, are a part of what we have to learn. Yet I would say, in my experiences, my best learning moments have been when I've been rock bottom, when I just had to admit, you don't really know that, Peggy. So what are you going to do to bring it up? Yeah, that's part of it. Okay, somewhat related to this is this wonderful research out of Holland in a book called Threshold Concepts, and you'll see it in the bibliography here if you want to read it. Just extraordinary research across multiple disciplines about placing students in pathways, even early on in their learning, difficult pathways usually, that having put them through that pathway change the way students view a subject, see things differently, go beyond, I know the definition of this to say, I understand how this term relates to that term, or how this term changes within the context of this. And I find that this is really exciting because it relates to another piece of research I'll share with you called learning progressions, in which people are looking at the sets of knowledge, abilities, self-reflectiveness, and self-monitoring that occur early on in the learning of something that we build on. Now, in my world, what we did is we separated those things out. So we would say you first have to have this skill. This course is basically the skill. This is the content. And the thinking now is multiple aspects of the learning have to occur simultaneously, and that's what we're building up as opposed to discrete and siloed. The way this played out for me recently was working with a couple of medical schools in which they said we have been rethinking how we initially prepare medical students. It used to be a lot of memory initially, but we realized that unless you have a context for that, then it's easy to forget. So what we do now is we introduce them to the systems of the body, and then the memory of the parts of the body, so to speak, just to give you an example, comes in next. But you got to have something to put that in. This also plays out in this interesting debate nationally about developmental courses for students, that some would assert it has to all be skill-based. Others are now arguing you've got to bring in content that the students will have to wrestle with in order to build those abilities to the appropriate level. If you get a chance to look at this, I can never put it down because there are interesting testimonials from students who will say, boy, I understand economic principles much more differently now than I had just said, memorized them and given you the descriptions or tried to identify them in a particular text. So just to make this real for you, an example of this would be if someone said, we're putting you in the middle of the night in a house you've never been in before, lights are out, you figure out how that house works. how to go through that house. And all I can do is, move piece to piece. So I define and I identify things until I find the light switch. Once that's on, I'm good to go. That's really what they're talking about. You see relationships, you understand things more comprehensively, and the intricacies better than you've ever had before. And that may be one of the things we need to think about in terms of the narrow-mindedness, is we've got to put people in the situation such as that. We know that people do learn differently, and they will hold on to naive knowledge, concepts, incorrect concepts, misunderstandings, and false information. We heard a little bit of that now. But are there any particular concepts in your field that you would say are very difficult for students to get their arms around, or they'll jump back to something they believed before? Think of any examples where that might be true for you? Yes?
The biggest struggle I have getting students to think theoretically on the psychology.
Yes.
Human sexuality, where there's like 6 different theories that you can use to interpret 7 different, and they just walk away with that.
Okay, so they don't move to that particular level.
That lends to a theory.
Yes, right. The other day, someone in, I think this was cultural anthropology, said that the students have great difficulty accepting that cousins can marry other cousins. And so as much as I teach and I give examples, they'll see this as a moral issue. And they'll say, well, that's just wrong. So they can't move outside of what's going on there. This will be key to the first case study I'm going to share with you. This is what we're really shooting for, I think, in our best work, is the ability to develop deep learning that is stored here and here, which comes from an incredible amount of practice. So it's really not a surprise for me that students have difficulties moving from drills to written problems because they haven't had the practice of deconstructing those case studies to be able to see how I apply the drill work that I've done to what's going on here. But this has strong implications for the scholarship of teaching beyond the course that I'm teaching, but to say in relationship to where my students go in the major and the program of study, how well are students able to draw on what I taught them a semester, 2 semesters from here. So this other new piece that's come out, this has come out primarily from work in the sciences, has to do with learning progressions. And again, these 2 pieces of research are really focused on how to develop the deeper learning in students, learning that will travel with them. And in this particular work, what I stated before is that there's consideration about what students simultaneously need to learn as they enter a particular field or even a one-time course, and how you build on those interrelationships or web-like intersections over time, and that it can't just be always separated out. So this really calls for highly collaborative commitment to the design of the curricular, even co-curricular relationship here. What are the sets that we're looking at, and then defining the ones that students are having difficulty with part of this. So what we're looking at then is moments along students' learning when we're dipping down to look at their work to see how well those sets are being developed and what's being held off, so that we can increase the understanding from there. We know that the metacognitive processes, and last time we talked about self-reflective pieces in students' work, are a significant way of reinforcing learning or enabling students to identify what they're having difficulty with. I still don't understand this. I'm struggling with this. And this actually becomes a significant source or resource for you in research, is to find out from students themselves in either group work, self-reflective pieces, or think alouds, which I'll talk about, what it is they're struggling with that maybe they can't articulate, but you can see it when you hear their think alouds. That's really where I think some fascinating action is. And we are looking for this. In order for the sustained enduring learning to take place, we need to think about how we move from short-term to longer-term memory. How do we move this into longer-term memory to enhance enduring learning. So here's it's a simple example, but it's telling what happened. The issue of engagement that we were talking about before is so critical to whatever it is we want students to learn. That we were interested in, this is a project out of Rutgers University, in looking at the work of successful and not so successful students, including that the work was across all fields. So it didn't matter whether these were sociology students or mathematics students or whatever the profession was. What we found is that successful students are always making meaning. All right, so if I'm in your class and I'm listening to you, I'm translating what you're saying into my notes. I am not writing down every single word you say. I'm actually in the mode of translating. And what I am also doing is identifying clues in what I'm writing. And this translates often into asking questions. But I will ask questions of you because I'm still not clear about that. So I didn't quite understand it in what I heard from you. Then I evaluate my notes after class. I may even reorganize my notes. So I'm still involved in the learning even when I leave the classroom. I work with peers and I compare my notes, and you can see the rest of these. Consolidation. What we found in the work of less successful students was more of a transcription of what went on. It's the old highlighter, yellow, pink highlighter, everything down there. But my takeaway from this was that the learning that's occurring for the strong students is a continual process, right? So it goes beyond my being in the class or online. What happens with the weaker students is they close their book, the notebook, and they open it the night before the test. So their first learning, so to speak, of that material is the night before the test. Whereas with the stronger students, there's a continuum that has taken place because the interpretive process has been triggered from the moment on. So they're, in a sense, refreshing their memory. The others are just learning it for the first time. This played out in an interesting experience with an institution in which people who were teaching introductory philosophy were bemoaning the fact that when they would ask students to read a particular tract the night before in preparation for discussing it, nobody wanted to discuss it. So this is across 10 sections. So in our discussions, I said, well, what do you think this means? And they said, well, we don't think they're doing the work. So I said, you don't really know that. Why don't you ask them? So they went in and they asked, and the students said, yeah, we read it and read it and read it, but we didn't really understand how to read it. And that's the trigger. So what the faculty decided to do was to flash up a text, a tract on the board, and go through the processes that they go through to make meaning. Because what they were, when we looked at their notes or their parents, what we saw was all the highlighters being used, from the very first word to the last word, were underlined. So there's no discrimination here. But I think there the takeaway is they really weren't sure how to approach that kind of text. So that's something for all of us to think about, is how do we enable students to approach the text? What does it take? What stance do I bring towards that? But I think really fascinating in terms of what strong students are doing. We know that practice is really important. And the new piece that I think is going to come out more in the literature has to do with sustained time on the learning of X, not just that the engagement be the same time. So the practice in various contexts over 2, 3, 4 years can lead to enduring learning. And the difference I like to make is between inert learning, which is something we got in there, but I can only give you maybe the definition, but I'm really not sure what it relates to, and it may only last for 24 hours or so, versus activated learning that's there, connected to previous learning or other learning. So it can be pulled forward in a new situation that I'm involved with. It's not lost. And so the practice and the various levels of practice are really important here. And that the transfer into new and different contexts is absolutely essential for the enduring learning to take place. So it can't just be in my course or in this particular situation, it's got to be in other situations, it's got to be in experiential learning. But we ourselves have to know where those experiences are, which calls for far more collaboration among all of us in our programs than we have ever experienced historically, because principally we've been rewarded for solo work, not for collaborative work. So all of this says to us, what do we want students to demonstrate, represent, or produce? Yes, at the end of a course or experience, but what about long term? What are the sets of outcomes that I want my students to be able to demonstrate? Usually SOTA will begin with a smaller unit, such as the course or the experience. But what I'm going to argue is it's important to share what you learn to inform colleagues, because this could be on the road towards systemic change, systemic innovation. But here's what I think is the fascinating. What are the chronological barriers, obstacles, misunderstandings that prohibit students from succeeding or achieving at higher levels? And what do we know about them from the moment they matriculate to along the way? Do they already exist? Did they just happen now as they learn this new information? Are they bringing something historically with them that is incorrect for what we're looking for? And how well do we identify and discuss these barriers with our colleagues in order to inform our practices? So initially this could be solo work in a course, but over time I think we've got to talk collaboratively about the progression, the journey that we're engaging students in, and what we need students to be able to do for a period of time. So if we, let's say, let students go with a C, C minus, how does that play out for them in the field? And I'm going to demonstrate some of this now in some real-life examples that we will look at. And these are all examples of SOTA. First is a case study from, any of you familiar with this, called the FET project from the University of Colorado? Love this work. And Carl Wieman, is it Wieman or Wyman? Wyman. I know him through email, but I wasn't sure the pronunciation. Knows, and physicists generally know, that entry-level physics students possess a wide range of incorrect conceptual understanding about concepts of physics and mathematics that you need to have to be a successful physics student. So the question he poses to his colleagues is, how do we restructure incorrect understanding of concepts? And the way he knows this is that physicists, and this is used in chemistry also, use something called concept inventories. These are brief scenarios in which students have to identify the concept that underlies the scenario. But what happens is, because they have personalized their learning, individualized their learning, in situations, 3 situations that should have the same conceptual reasoning behind them, will come up with different kinds of reasoning based on the individual situation. So I guess I'd say they're unable to generalize across different situations to say this is the explanation, because they come up with highly personalized individual reasoning behind that. But the larger problem with this is, because the design of the curriculum becomes more conceptually heavy, more complex, as students progress, more and more of them drop out, fail, and keep up with the pace of the work. But it's because this early level of learning is not correct. Right? And in fact, he says it's such a problem that students don't even hear what we say, because they have locked into them this sense of what these concepts would be. So there's the struggle goes on and on and on. So what happens is, Freeman sort of positions his faculty to say, we got to ask ourselves how we're going to do this. So all of this work for me is driven by intellectual curiosity. It's the same driver as the curiosity we give to the field work that we do, for example, in our particular disciplines. It's just moving this into the arena of teaching learning. So how do we actually position students to restructure so that they will become better as they move forward in their work. Otherwise, we're going to lose a lot of students, or they're going to fail. Many of you maybe have experienced this in some of your disciplines, in which as students face mathematics in any course, they'll start to drop out. Or they'll say, a student once said to me in my linguistics class, "This is a linguistics course, it's not a math course," as if they're sort of separate worlds altogether. So the issue is, how do we prepare or bring people forward to be able to do this? All right, so what happens is, and if you go onto the PhET site, you'll see hundreds of these interactive simulations, each of which is focused on a particular quantitative or physics concept. And instead of, if I were the faculty member in physics, my doing a grandiose lecture or a demonstration, and what people were saying is, well, let's just do more of it. Maybe they'll get it. But it's not us doing more of it, it's the students doing more of it that we've learned from this. So individual students are given a problem in the physics class, and they need to solve the problem with everything that's here. So there's electricity, there's voltage meters, all that. So everything I need to solve the problem is there. So what I do as the students is I solve it in my individual, highly personalized way, but realize from the interaction here that it's wrong. Then I am more motivated to say, oh, I guess that isn't working. What should I do to make it work? Until finally it does work. And through regressions of this over and over and over for different concepts, what he now can show is that it is possible to restructure incorrect understanding of the concepts. And that is now being traced as students move into higher level courses as well. In other words, that the learning is still there. It has not dropped off as a part of it. And so successful that these are now developed in graduate programs as well, as far as I know. This, for me, is one of my best examples of the scholarship of teaching and learning that involves assessing the learning to determine, one, what's wrong, and two, to determine whether what I do is actually making a difference to improve it. What he does, and we'll look at this in the workshop a little bit more closely, is he does consult the research on learning, and at the same time says, oh my gosh, when I do my public lectures to naive audiences about physics, I use these, and people have clickers, I think he does it in the audience, and he said the first thing that my audience talks about are their engagement with this. Why hadn't I thought about that before? But he needed that against what the research was saying about levels of engagement and activated learning. So here's a good use of evidence-based. First, let me locate the problem. Two, let me look at whether or not what we're thinking and designing is actually working. And the interesting thing is that he uses think alouds as part of the development of the project. So he actually uses students when he develops these and listens to them solving the problem to make sure that these simulations actually work. But the whole idea behind this is each student is interacting with this world as opposed to looking at it and somebody else doing it for me. Okay, and again, significant. So I'm going to ask you, we're not going to have time to do all of these, but how does that physics problem reflect what you might be experiencing with your students? Maybe not precisely the same, but could you discuss very briefly, and we'll pull a couple forward, how that might play out in your discipline, profession, or what you're teaching? And then, how is that manifested, or what are the longer-term effects of that, should I say, with students? I'm just going to do one other case study. There's another case study in here of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. This is also one of my favorite ones because it comes from, actually I've just been working with this faculty member on this, from a faculty member who for years and years has been teaching a general education history course. And he said, they just want to see it as rote memory. That's how they have traditionally, learned this. And they just sort of pass through the course. What I want them to be able to do is to engage in these higher levels of thinking, problem-solving analysis here, as opposed to this traditional one. And he said, I was stumped for quite a while, but I began looking at, and this is usually a process that SOTL people go through, looking at research in journals about how people have tackled this same particular issue. and comes across, very briefly, a process used at Barnard College called reacting to the past, which involves the learning and the teaching of history, but it's through a game simulation. But in order to play the game, and this is really very interesting, and I'll jump a little bit here, the students have to read and synthesize historical texts and secondary resources. So you can't just play the game out of intuition, so to speak. You have to build up the knowledge base first in order to integrate this. And then this is leading them to writing papers and to engaging in debates and taking on the historical persona of that. And what he's still working on, because initially he said, I think it's improving, and that's the important thing, is you got to be clear about what do you mean by improving. What were they doing before that you were unhappy with? And there's where your use of criteria and standards of judgment is really important. What are you specifically looking at when you say, I want them to become good problem solvers, for example? Can you break that down? And then based on the method that you use or you attempt to experiment with, how specifically are those criteria moved or shaped as a result of that? And he said it only takes, he said, I thought I would do a number of games. It's actually taken a full semester because the work is so intense in doing this. Another good example. So sometimes the scholarship isn't, I have to reinvent. Sometimes you can look to see what other people are doing and say, would that be appropriate for me to try? Let me try it. Maybe I'm tweaking it. Maybe I'm changing it a little bit. And to see. What he's more interested in now is the enduring learning. Is as these students move into other courses, will they retain these abilities that he's attempting to do? So we don't have too much time for the others. The other one has to do with writing, and in this case, an engineering program. I'll just go back really quickly. Says we're not happy with the writing we're seeing students doing in our engineering courses. We expect them to think critically, to be able to write, and to be able to present their findings, let's say, visually. So what he says is, we have one writing course that they have when they come in as freshmen. They take one other writing intensive course outside of our field, but we don't see any change in the writing. Seeks a connection with colleagues in communication studies who say, you know, the research shows that students' writing ability becomes stronger if they are intellectually engaged in their learning. So you're right on if you're willing to integrate writing into your engineering courses. And doggone it, do they not only do it with the one, it's through every course now. And it is also, you'll see in this, the research that he uncovered said that intellectual skills promote the writing, not the reverse. So the skills don't promote just the writing, it's the intellectual engagement that promotes the writing, so that the writing, and it's within the field as well, so students see the context of that. All right, so going down to a home stretch here with some questions you might have is, how do you do this yourself? What you do is you come up with a research or study question. And the reason I call it a study question is it doesn't necessarily have to be high, always empirical research necessarily in the beginning. And you may, in fact, want to be locating what the problem is more specifically initially as the first step in your research. But these research or study questions can come up around the water cooler. At the end of the semester, when you have looked at a lot of student work or graded papers and you're in a state of frustration and you say, I could have sworn they would be able to do this, but I just don't see it in their graduating level work or in the program level work around. So you might want to cull from those levels of frustration to say, what is it that's holding them up? What did we expect them to do, but we don't see that happening? And could you identify with that right now? If you've looked at senior level work, let's say, and you put it down and you're frustrated, what would be frustrating you? It could be in your discipline, it could be about writing, it could be, what is it that's, you'd say, I expected more. Yeah, I mean, it's not just germane to what you're saying here. I mean, we're seeing it in a lot of, this project that I just came from, we saw it. You know, and people were sort of upset, and the best part about using your own scoring rubrics in your student work is they're your students. It's not somebody else making the comment. It's what you're seeing. And so I think we really do have to say, what are we going to do about it? And one of the things I know from students is that they like to navigate the curriculum, which means that if they know someone's going to ask them to write, they will be advised by their colleagues, say, well, don't take her, because she has to write. Or the same thing with quantitative reasoning. Don't go there, but you'll have to do that, is our ability to say there's no place to run. And for us, and then because this was my raw experience, it meant that all of us had some writing in every course. It didn't have to be huge, because students can make as many errors in a paragraph as they can in a 5-paper one. With feedback, it's got to be the practice and the feedback. And I think there's some difficulty with what people call double scoring, where I gave you an A for content, but a D for, I wouldn't do that. I would just say, I couldn't read this. This is gone. But for us, it meant faculty development focused on helping people understand how they could integrate some writing and give some feedback in the common scoring rubric. Because we knew that students were navigating. But we needed to see it first in our graduating students' work. I mean, I'd have to say that that's really what we had to come to terms with. And if people would say, well, I really feel that, you work so hard, I should have given them. But I think we can't do that. I think what we're talking about is some standards and criteria. What's at least a minimum expectation, which is the value of the scoring rubrics at AAC&U has developed, is there's the aspirational level, which you may not all be at right now, but then there's the level of at least they need to be here to say they graduated from the institution. But that will take high-level faculty development. It's actually fun. Because people do have wonderful assignments. And I was very sensitive to this because people would say, I'm not an expert in teaching writing, Peggy. But I'd say you're an expert in your field, and if we can help you develop a rubric so that you don't have to correct it. In fact, you shouldn't. Research would show don't correct it because they'll just do it based on your correction, would be to say, here are the patterns that you're having difficulty with. You got to pay attention to these. But that would take some faculty development work to do it, but it can be done. Think about any previous assessments that you have at hand that you've talked about that might jettison your research or study question. And in the workshop, I'll give a whole slew of possible ones. And then finally, I think you have a packet here that lists one of the many handouts. It's actually the handout number 2 on page 4, is to think about using a taxonomy. You could do this only for your course or experience, or you could use this with colleagues along a program of study to track the persistent problems that students encounter. So what you do is, after you've marked their work, is in this chart, it's a very simple chart, you indicate what's the difficulty you are seeing in the student work, the performance. What's the context? This is really important. What's the context in which you see that problem being played out? So example would be, scientists will often tell me this, is that a student's abilities to analyze in a research project, for example, drop off considerably as they move into that arena. So it's the context. They maybe can give you the definition, as I said, but when they actually have to use that in the context, that's where the trouble is. So if you see a pattern of that, then you say, all right, so maybe this is the area of our research. And if you have access to the students, I think we need to work more with students to get them to articulate what they're having difficulty with. And in the list of methods of assessment, one of them that I'll share this afternoon is to use word edit bubbles. So when students are reading or writing or they can insert into the word edit bubble where they're stumped, where they're having difficulty with. So more and more, I think, as we look at learning process, we're going to figure out why they're having difficulties, and then that difficulty has to come back to me or to us to say, how are we going to innovate pedagogy instruction or the design of the curriculum to account for that? So this might be a way of generating that. A discussion with colleagues who say, I still see them having difficulty with it here, here, and here. That then comes back to us to say, so what do we think we need to do about that? I'm a big proponent of bringing students into the design physics people did, to hear them say what's working and what's being difficult. Another interesting strategy you can use, but you always want to use at least two methods in your assessment of the work that you're looking at, is what's called SAL. Maybe some of you use it, Student Assessment of Their Learning Gains. .edu. And this was developed at the University of Wisconsin system, and almost everybody I talked to said I really like it. It's designed, the first time I have seen an effort made to have students talk about what they actually learned in a course. But I think you could use it along a program of study. It is an online program in which I insert my outcomes for the course or the experience, and the pedagogies that I use to teach that, and I ask students, how well did you learn that outcome based on that pedagogy? It's very powerful. It generates a chart that shows you your highs and lows, and it was one of the other reasons that I changed the way I taught linguistics, because I thought I was crystal clear about this particular concept. And I obviously was not, because in the report back they would say, we still do not understand what you mean when you use that word. So this is an advancement over end of semester when they say, yeah, I liked her, it was a great course, showed up on time, those things, to get really into the meat of it about what did I actually learn. I would never use that as my sole source of evidence for change or for looking at their outcomes. I would always look at direct evidence of student work, because if you rely on their self-perceptions, sometimes they can under or overestimate themselves. But it is a very powerful tool to use along with actually looking at student work. So in the history one, the historian used SAL, and students said they liked it, but I said, now you got to go back and actually look at their work to say, are you seeing an advancement in their ability to analyze, for example, move through there. So there's just some strategies for just germinating some ideas for a research problem. This is just a couple of examples of researcher study questions. I have a much longer list in the handout that you can look at that might just trigger what you might think about doing. But this is the issue of incorrect understandings can interfere and do interfere with students' progression. Looking at how successful and unsuccessful students are doing, or how do students make transitions between studying algebra and then trigonometry. It just happens. I think they need to know what those worlds are, how they're different. And I wish I had known as an undergrad that algebra is used for modeling. It would have made more sense to me. It was for me just drills, but actually it's highly functional. But how do we help people make the transition into those worlds that can be useful for moving them? What about these obstacles that occur along the way? And what are the cognitive difficulties, for example, that students face as things become increasingly more complex? But that's really related to the design of the curriculum. So we saw that. What you do want to think about for a really rich sort of project is, what do you know about students when they enter? What do you know along the way based on your implementation? What do you know at the end? So you've really got 3 assessment points. Did they know it when they came? Was the problem already there? And then how did we monitor and advance it? What did we do along the way? And all of this would be used applying criteria and standards of judgment to the work. So you have something very specific to say about change or improvement, as opposed to saying, well, we think they improved as a result of it. So the best part about this is if we collaboratively engage in this, we can be the next generation, create the next generation of curricular, co-curricular design. And we know that learning has no boundaries, so the more that we work with colleagues from student affairs, support services, library, and information resources, the more powerful I think the projects will be in the design of them. And students will talk about learning in multiple contexts and the moments in which they really deeply learn something, and we can learn a lot from them as a result of this. So, if we move in here, this is what I think we're really shooting for. We need the research, we need the knowledge to be able to get that to them. So may the force be with you.